Tonight, we're diving into a story straight from the wild edges of the world, a place where trappers sleep beside wolves and roast strange meals under endless skies. It's a world of sharp winds, roaring fires, and the kind of quiet that echoes for miles. If you enjoy getting lost in these midnight journeys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, but only if it feels right for you. It helps more than you know. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? I love seeing how many corners of the world gather here to listen together. Grab a warm drink, settle in, and let your mind wander. You're exactly where you need to be. Let's step into the story. Imagine a night so cold your breath turns to tiny ice crystals before it even leaves your lips. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones and settles there like an unwelcome guest. Out here in the Rockies, that's just another Tuesday night. The trappers knew it well. They learned to respect it, or they wouldn't last long enough to see the morning light. They didn't sleep in cozy cabins or under thick wool blankets. No, they wrapped themselves in stiff, greasy animal hides, the smell of old fur clinging to them like a second skin. Some nights, they burrowed into hastily dug snow caves, pushing in as deep as they could, hoping the icy walls wouldn't collapse in their sleep. Other times, they curled up beside their half-wild dogs or even pressed close to the bodies of wolves brave or foolish, enough to wander near the fire's edge. In the dark, you could hear the wolves singing to the stars, a lonely, bone-deep sound that seemed to echo inside your skull. If you were lucky, you'd drift off before you started imagining those glowing eyes getting closer, their breath mixing with your own in the frozen air. If not, well, you kept your rifle close and your nerves closer. They say you don't really sleep out here. You drift in and out, always half listening for the snap of a twig or the low rumble of something large moving just beyond the glow of your little fire. A trapper's dreams were stitched together with the sounds of cracking ice and faraway howls. More a restless waiting than true rest. They'd wake with icicles hanging from their beards, fingers stiff as old nails, and eyes bloodshot from the smoke of damp wood that never quite caught. The smell out there was a wild blend of wet fur, pine sap, and wood smoke, all tangled together in your hair, your clothes, your very skin. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, you'd catch a whiff of your own scent and laugh. If you didn't laugh, you'd probably cry. Out here, humor wasn't a luxury. It was a survival tool as sharp as any blade. Food wasn't something you thought of as pleasure. It was fuel, plain and simple. A strip of half-frozen beaver tail might be all that stood between you and the long, eternal sleep under a snowdrift. The tail, roasted slowly over a low fire, turned gelatinous and greasy. Some swore it was a delicacy. Most just chewed it and tried not to think too much about it. On truly bitter nights, when even the wolves thought twice about wandering too close, trappers huddled together for warmth. You'd find men stacked like logs, shivering and grumbling about missing fingers or ears. They cursed the cold, cursed each other, cursed the distant world that felt like a dream they might have once had. And yet, in all that misery, there was something oddly tender about these moments. Maybe it was the way the stars looked so sharp above, like tiny daggers pricking the heavens. Maybe it was the rare crack of shared laughter, echoing through the pines. Or the quiet comfort of knowing you weren't alone in the fight against the endless dark. When dawn finally crawled over the peaks, the light was weak and watery, but it felt like a miracle every single time. You'd stretch your frozen limbs, stomp around to get the blood flowing, and force down whatever scraps you had left. Another day survived meant another chance to tell a story by the fire, if you made it that far. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't glamorous. It was life on the edge, where every breath felt borrowed and every sunrise felt like a small, defiant victory. Some mornings, if you looked closely, you'd see frost clinging to eyebrows and mustaches like a thin layer of white moss. The fire would hiss and spit when someone tossed on a new log, the smoke curling up into the pale sky as if it were too tired to rise properly. Men shifted and stretched, wincing as they coaxed life back into their joints. No one ever really said good morning. It was more of a low grunt or a crooked half-smile that meant, "We made it through another one." Breakfast was an exercise in patience and teeth-gritting determination. A lump of cold meat, maybe a bit of gritty coffee if you were lucky enough to have any left. Hands shook as they tried to hold tin cups, steam drifting past cracked lips and dry tongues. The simple act of swallowing felt like a triumph. Every sip was a small battle won against the cold, against the hunger, against the thoughts of home that crept in like slow poison. By mid-morning, the men would gather their traps, checking lines they'd set the day before. The rivers were half frozen, shimmering under the pale sun like glass. To step into that water was to invite a pain that shot straight through your bones and made you question every choice that brought you here. But the lure of beaver pelts and otter skins was strong. Those soft, shining furs promised trade, promised supplies, maybe even a scrap of comfort come spring. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes your heartbeat sound louder than a drum. Every snapped twig felt like an alarm bell. Birds sometimes flitted past in quick, nervous bursts, their wings flashing white against the dark pines. The men learned to move slowly, to breathe shallow, to keep their minds fixed on the task and not on the cold gnawing at their fingers. When the traps were empty, heads hung low. A missed catch meant another night of lean eating, another day of wandering the icy banks. When they found a prize, a fat beaver or a sleek fox, the mood would lift, if only for a moment. There might even be a short laugh or a slap on the back. Those small victories, as fleeting as they were, could light a man up from the inside, if only briefly. By the time the sun started slipping behind the mountains, the sky turned to a pale watercolor of purples and grays. Campfires sparked back to life. Men shuffled closer, rubbing their hands together as they sat on logs or stones. Someone might hum a half-forgotten tune, a broken lullaby from a mother's lips long ago. The others listened in silence, eyes on the flames, each lost in a private fog of memories and silent bargains with the night. Stories came out reluctantly, like shy animals peeking from their dens. Tall tales of impossible hunts, of ghostly figures glimpsed through the trees, of close calls with bears or sudden blizzards. No one cared if they were true. Out there, truth was a loose thing, bending and twisting like smoke. What mattered was the rhythm of the words, the warmth they carried across the circle. When the last log was thrown on the fire, men wrapped themselves tight again in their furs, pulling them up to their noses. Eyes blinked heavily, but no one ever really surrendered fully to sleep. Each man drifted in a fragile half-dream, mind wandering between the stars overhead and the sound of snow shifting in the dark. The night was long, longer than you'd think. Every rustle of wind or distant crack of ice sent shivers crawling up spines already stiff with dread. Some whispered a prayer to the dark sky, to old gods, to anyone who might be listening. And so it went night after night, a slow dance with cold and hunger, with loneliness so thick you could almost feel it brushing against your cheek. Yet every morning they rose again. Another day, another fight. When dawn crept back, pale and reluctant, men stirred like old bears shaking off heavy dreams. There were no cheers, no grand declarations of bravery, only quiet, resigned movements as they pulled on frozen boots and gathered their tools. Frost cracked underfoot, each step a reminder that the world out here was sharp, unforgiving. The early chores were a ritual in themselves, checking the perimeter, gathering thin twigs and logs for the day's fires, scraping ice from saddles and gear. Fingers fumbled, stiff and red, each task a small ordeal that demanded patience and curses whispered into the cold air. One man might grumble about a missing glove, another about a broken strap, but most complaints drifted off before they truly found their voice. They moved slowly toward the river again, packs heavy with traps and dreams of pelts worth their weight in gold. The river's edge shimmered with a thin crust of ice, breaking like glass under each cautious step. Sometimes, A man would pause to watch his reflection ripple, surprised by the hollow-eyed stranger staring back. He might wonder if the face belonged to the same young fool who once believed in warm beds and steady meals. Midday offered no relief, only a slightly brighter gray above and a deeper ache in the muscles. They trudged on, stopping here and there to reset a snare, to trace fresh tracks, to squint into the woods for a hint of movement. Every success felt like a gift snatched from a stingy god. A single fox meant warmth and trade, maybe even an extra sip of whiskey on a distant day. When the sun began its slow descent again, a hush fell over the woods. Shadows stretched long and thin, like the fingers of a watchful spirit. The trappers retreated to their chosen hollow or clearing, feet dragging, eyes scanning the horizon for threats they could name and countless others they could only feel. As they gathered around new fires, a sense of fragile safety settled among them, fragile as a frostbitten toe. The talk was sparse, words rationed as carefully as powder and meat. A short joke here, a muttered memory there. Echoes of another life that felt impossibly far away. One man might mention a brother back east. Another might murmur a woman's name and fall silent, his gaze fixed on the firelight dancing in the snow. Sometimes, the group shared stories of close calls. A night when wolves prowled too close, their eyes glittering just beyond the firelight. A sudden avalanche that roared down a slope and swallowed a camp whole, leaving only a few battered traps behind. Each tale was told with a quiet reverence, not to boast but to remember, to mark the thin line they all walked each day. As darkness took over, stars stitched their way across the sky, icy points of light that felt both comforting and cruel. A few men would try to hum a soft tune, but the sound usually faded into the sigh of the wind. Even the toughest voices grew tender in those moments, the melodies thin and uncertain. Eventually, each man curled into his furs, pulling them tight around his head, trying to create a small world of warmth and darkness. Dreams came slowly, scattered like sparks drifting above a fire. They carried fragments of home, a mother's stew bubbling in a big iron pot, the rough bark of a childhood tree, a dog barking at the gate. Out here, time stretched and bent in strange ways. A single night might feel like a month. A morning might arrive so quietly that it almost felt like a mercy. Yet somehow, each man managed to rise again, day after day, feet numb and hearts stubborn as mule hooves. It wasn't heroism that kept them going. It was something quieter, rougher, a kind of simple promise made to the self on a dark, frozen night. Keep moving, keep breathing, and maybe, just maybe, see another sunrise. Some days, the men didn't speak at all, moving like ghosts between the trees. Every sound felt sharper in that silence. The brittle snap of a twig, the quiet shush of snow falling off a pine branch, the low groan of an ice-covered river shifting beneath its own weight. It was a world alive with quiet dangers and small, hidden wonders. They learned to read tracks like letters from an old friend. A fresh line of paw prints in the snow might lead to a fox den or an otter's secret slide into the water. Sometimes, they found claw marks on a tree, a silent message from a bear reminding them they weren't alone out there. Even the birds left hints. Sudden flights, nervous chatter, quick shadows darting above. Food was always on their minds. Not fine meals, but the rough, desperate question, what can we eat today? A chunk of dried meat, a scrap of moldy bread, or, if luck turned its face their way, a fat rabbit or fish from a half-frozen stream. They took what they could find and learned not to complain because out there, a full belly was a story worth telling twice. During the harshest afternoons, when the cold felt like it might crack bones, some men would lean against a tree and close their eyes for a moment too long. Their breath would hang around them like a private fog. In those moments, thoughts drifted, to warm kitchens, to soft hands, to the echo of a fiddle at a barn dance far away. A single memory could both comfort and wound at the same time. Evenings arrived early and sudden, as if someone had snuffed out the day with a giant hand. The world turned blue and then black, and the fires lit up again, small beacons in an endless sea of white and shadow. Men sat close, shoulders touching, trading warmth as much as words. Sometimes they told stories they barely believed themselves. A giant elk that could vanish into thin air, a ghostly figure wandering the ridge at moonrise, a lake so deep it swallowed whole wagons and never gave them back. Laughter would break through, rough and surprised, then quickly die back into the hush of the night. Sleep was never peaceful. Dreams twisted into half-memories of creaking floorboards, warm hearths, and the soft weight of quilts. A man might startle awake at the crack of a branch, heart pounding, hand groping for a rifle. But after a moment of stillness, he would pull the furs tighter and slip back into that uneasy drift. In the darkest hours, stars above seemed so bright they hurt to look at. Men watched them through half-closed eyes, tracing silent prayers or promises into the sky. Somewhere in the back of their minds, they might wonder what those stars looked like from home, whether someone else was staring up at them too. By morning, boots were stiff as boards, and fingers barely moved without pain. But still they rose. Each man fought the same quiet battle. A battle of willpower over weakness, of small daily choices to keep going when every part of the body screamed to stop. The mountains were their silent companions, standing tall and unmoved, watching each struggle unfold with ancient indifference. Each ridge and valley carried whispers of men who had come before, who had laughed, cursed, and finally vanished into snowdrifts or icy rivers. The living knew this truth in their bones. Each step was a borrowed moment. Yet, for all the danger and hardship, there was an odd sweetness hidden in it all. A shared glance across the fire, the simple joy of warm broth sliding down a raw throat, the first golden glow of sunlight crawling down a frosty peak. These small mercies stitched the men together, binding them more tightly than any oath. And so, each day bled into the next, a tapestry of cold dawns, quiet trails, and long, restless nights. Every moment hard-earned, every breath a stubborn refusal to yield to the wild. As winter clawed deeper into the land, the men learned to listen to the world in ways most folks back east could never imagine. The whisper of wind through the pines wasn't just a sound. It was a warning, a soft voice telling them when a storm might roll down the slopes or when game might be on the move. The creak of a distant tree under heavy snow might set every head turning, eyes sharp and wary. The traps became both a lifeline and a quiet torment. Each morning, they trudged through knee-deep drifts, their breath hanging like banners behind them. Finding a sprung trap with nothing inside meant hunger, meant one more day scraping the bottom of the ration sack. But finding a heavy, thrashing catch, that was a moment of silent celebration. No cheers, just a deep sigh, a pat on the frozen metal, a whispered thanks to luck or fate. Skinning and cleaning by the riverside was no gentle task. Fingers went numb quickly, knives slipped, and more than one man carried scars from careless slices made in the rush to beat the cold. Blood froze in dark lines along their sleeves and soaked into their woolen shirts, turning stiff and heavy by the time they finished. At night, they might share the bounty in small bites, gnawing on roasted scraps, grease shining on cracked lips. Someone might pass around a canteen, the liquor burning down their throats like fire in a dry cabin. A few rough jokes would spark up, sudden and bright, and die out just as quickly under the weight of fatigue and the endless dark pressing close. Sleep still offered little mercy. Even curled together, shivering under shared hides, the cold found ways to sneak in. Dreams turned strange and tangled, filled with voices from home, with phantom meals and lost dances under lantern light. A sudden shout in the night would jolt them all awake, hearts thundering, eyes wide and wild. One by one, they'd settle back, breath slowing, heads sinking back into damp blankets. Come morning, they rose slow, stiff as barn doors left out in the rain. But they rose. They always did. Boots slammed against logs to knock out the ice, hands rubbed raw to chase life back into them. A splash of river water to the face felt like a slap from a ghost, but it cleared the fog just enough to start again. Sometimes, a man would wander a few paces away, looking out at the endless white hills, the frozen creeks winding like pale veins through the valley floor. You could almost see the thoughts drifting across his face. Questions about how many more mornings like this he could take, or memories of a life that felt unreal under all that sky. In those moments, the world felt both impossibly big and crushingly close. Every echo off a distant cliff, every gust of icy wind across the campfire embers, felt like a voice calling them deeper into the wilderness. And somehow they answered, not with words, but with each reluctant footstep forward, each fire lit against the long dark. As the moon climbed high and the stars crowded close, they kept their quiet vigils by the flames. Sparks shot upward, fading into the night like tiny, fleeting prayers. Some men stared into the fire as if it held secrets they might finally understand. Others watched the treeline, waiting for movement that might mean danger, or dinner, or sometimes both. It was a world that tested them daily, a place where every choice mattered, where every small mercy felt like a gift handed down from the sky. Yet, even as they fought for each breath and each scrap, a strange sort of peace wrapped around them, thin as a fox pelt, but real enough to hold. By the time the first pale hints of dawn touched the mountaintops, they had already decided. Another day, another chance. They stood, shook out their furs, and began again, hearts heavy but steady as an old trapper's knife. Some mornings, the wind carried voices, or at least that's what it felt like after weeks in the wild. You'd swear you heard a fiddle tune drifting from a distant ridge, or a woman's laughter echoing across the snowfields. But when you turned your head, there was nothing but the sighing of pines and the low creak of old trees settling into the frost. They didn't talk much about these sounds around the fire. Maybe a quick glance, a flicker of understanding in a pair of tired eyes. Everyone knew the mind played tricks out there, when sleep was thin and the cold gnawed at the edges of reason. Still, the hints of a faraway world reminded them of softer days, of warm rooms filled with voices, of the smell of baking bread drifting down a summer lane. When midday came, it brought no warmth. The sun might hang bright above, but its rays barely touched the frozen ground. Men hunched their shoulders against the wind, heads low, eyes scanning the white crust for tracks or hidden traps. The days felt endless, yet always urgent. Each hour another chance to find food or fail trying. A lucky find could turn the entire mood. A beaver pulled from a creek, its fur thick and shimmering even under a film of ice. A rabbit caught near a thicket, ears still warm. The men worked quickly, knives flashing in practiced hands, knowing every moment spent meant more risk to stiffening fingers and trembling legs. In the late afternoon, as shadows began to stretch and blue crept into the snow, they would start back toward camp. Packs felt heavier but were carried with a quiet pride. Each step back meant warmth, however small, and maybe a chance to trade a story for a moment of laughter. Once huddled around the fire again, their faces softened. Even the most hardened eyes found comfort in the glow, the soft crack and hiss of burning logs. A small pot might bubble with bits of meat and herbs gathered in better seasons, a thin broth that felt like a banquet after a day in the icy wild. They didn't eat fast. Every sip was savored, every piece turned over in the mouth as though tasting something rare and precious. Around them, darkness pressed close, but for a short while, the firelight was enough to keep it at bay. Stories drifted up like smoke, loose and meandering. A man might talk about a horse lost to a sudden blizzard or a near miss with a river that cracked and swallowed a comrade whole. No one interrupted. The silence between words felt just as important as the words themselves. Now and then, a spark would leap and land on a sleeve, and someone would slap at it absently, eyes never leaving the flames. The dance of light on their faces revealed the boys they once were. Sons running barefoot through summer fields. Young men chasing first loves through lantern-lit barns. The stars overhead looked so close they could be plucked down and pocketed. Men leaned back, shoulders resting against each other or against rough packs, and traced the shapes above in half-whispered breaths. Constellations turned into old stories. Hunters forever chasing bears across the sky. Maidens lost in midnight rivers of light. When sleep finally took them, it did so in slow waves. One man's head would drop, then another's, until only the fire kept watch. The last to fall asleep would poke at the embers, listening to the faint pops and hisses like a secret language meant just for him. And so, each night folded into the next, a slow shuffle of cards dealt by an indifferent hand. Each morning promised nothing except a new beginning, another small gamble against the wild, and perhaps the tiniest whisper of something soft waiting somewhere beyond the endless snow. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the men looked more like wraiths than trappers. Beards tangled and thick with frost, eyes deep-set and rimmed in red. Their clothes hung from their shoulders in tatters, heavy with smoke and grease, patched in so many places they barely resembled the sturdy coats they started with. But there was a kind of stubborn pride in each scar and stitch. Every cut, every tear, every frostbitten fingertip told a story. Stories of nights spent huddled in snow caves, of mornings woken by the eerie calls of wolves echoing between the pines, of days where a single rabbit meant the difference between another sunrise and a quiet end under a drift. The first hints of spring came shyly, almost embarrassed to appear. A thin melt of snow trickled down rocky slopes, the sound delicate as a whispered confession. Tiny buds poked out along bare branches, testing the air like cautious guests at a rough tavern door. Even the men, hardened and wary, seemed to breathe a little deeper, as if each lungful carried a sliver of hope. Yet with the thaw came new dangers. Rivers swelled and ran wild, tearing free from icy prisons and swallowing entire trails. Avalanches thundered down the mountainsides, unpredictable and merciless. Game grew restless and scarce, their tracks weaving strange, desperate paths across the wet earth. Still, the men kept moving, boots sucked into muddy hollows, packs heavy with soaked hides. Faces turned upward to catch the weak warmth of early sun, as though they might drink it straight into their bones. Around the fire, they spoke a little more, voices cracking but steady, daring to plan beyond the next dawn. There were talks of distant trading posts, of the possibility of new supplies, fresh powder, dry boots, maybe even a sweet cake or a letter from far away. The thought of these small luxuries lit sparks in tired eyes, and sometimes, if you looked closely, you might catch the ghost of a real smile playing at the corner of a bearded mouth. At night, the fires burned higher, wood easier to find as the snowline crept back up the slopes. They sat closer to the flames, stretching out legs stiff from months of ice. Someone might hum a tune remembered from a city street or a farmhouse porch, and for a moment, the wilderness felt almost gentle. Dreams grew stranger in those early spring nights. Men muttered and turned in their furs, haunted by images of fields in bloom, of warm kitchens, of hands they hadn't held in years. One might jolt awake, staring wide-eyed into the dark, heart hammering with a feeling he couldn't quite name, some mix of fear, longing, and the sharp, sweet pain of remembering who he once was. Morning brought new resolve. They checked traps with renewed energy, feet lighter, spirits a touch less burdened. Even failures stung a little less now, softened by the promise of change hanging in the warming air. Every step forward felt like a small rebellion against the months of silent suffering. The sound of ice cracking underfoot turned from threat to promise, a sign that the world might soon open up again. Each bird call sounded like a secret invitation to keep going, to see what lay just beyond the next ridge. The men knew better than to trust the mountains completely. Spring could turn back to winter in a single night, storms rolling down like a fist from the sky. But that thin edge of hope, It was enough to carry them one more day. One more fire, one more silent prayer to the stars above. And so, they pressed on, stubborn as ever, hearts stitched together by shared hardship and the quiet, unspoken vow to outlast whatever the wild threw their way. As days grew longer, small signs of life began to dot the valleys. Little flowers braved the edges of melting snowbanks, their bright heads nodding in the breeze as if in quiet applause. Birds returned in sudden flurries of motion and song, weaving new energy through the silent groves that had stood watch all winter. The men noticed it all, though they rarely spoke of it directly. A quick nod toward a patch of green, a slight lift of the brow at a bird's call. Small acknowledgments shared between hardened souls. After months of endless white and gray, these colors felt almost too bright to look at, like staring into a fire too long. New sounds crept into the camps at night. The hush of rain pattering on furs and gear, the gurgle of creeks freed from their icy cages. In the dark, these noises could be comforting or unnerving, depending on the man and the mood. Some took comfort in the rhythms of the thaw. Others lay awake, eyes wide, hearing danger in every droplet. By the fireside, talk shifted. Less about survival and more about trading routes, river crossings, and stories of outposts that might have fresh supplies. A rumor of a new trader bringing sugar or tobacco would spread through camp like wildfire, igniting small sparks of excitement in even the weariest hearts. Men began to dream not just in sleep but out loud. Pair of new boots, a clean shirt without patches, maybe even a bottle of whiskey, untouched by frost. These small dreams stitched themselves into the larger tapestry of each man's private hopes, binding them to the idea of tomorrow. When traps were checked now, there was more laughter. The clumsy slip into a cold creek no longer felt like a curse but a joke to be retold by the fire. Even the failures seemed lighter, as if the air itself had decided to share in the men's heavy burdens and lift them just enough to breathe easier. But the wild still watched. Late snow squalls could sweep down without warning, turning bright afternoons into white-out blizzards in minutes. Ice still hid beneath patches of mud, waiting to catch an unsuspecting foot and twist an ankle. Bears, waking hungry from their long sleep, prowled closer, sniffing at camps in the quiet hours before dawn. Every man carried a scar or two by this point, a physical map of close calls and lessons learned. The ache in a shoulder from a fall, the thin white line across a thumb from a hurried skinning job, the tender ribs from a night spent too close to a restless mule. These marks were badges of passage, tokens from a world that did not forgive weakness. As they moved through the valleys, the changing season painted everything in gentle chaos. Frozen rivers turned into roaring torrents, swallowing paths and hiding stones sharp as knives. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, thick and heady after months of dry cold. Even the sky felt different, shifting from its hard winter clarity to a softer, hazy blue that promised warmth and trickery. At night, they watched embers float into the new spring air, drifting high and vanishing into a sky crowded with stars. Conversations wandered further now, beyond the immediate needs of food and shelter, into the soft corners of memory and the fragile edges of future plans. Someone might mention a sweetheart waiting in a distant town, or a child's laughter echoing in an empty cabin far beyond the mountains. These quiet confessions rolled around the circle like a bottle passed hand to hand, each man taking a small sip of courage before passing it along. And for a few moments, each felt less alone, less like a ghost wandering endless woods and more like a brother in a rough, shivering family. Sleep came easier in the spring air, though dreams remained tangled. When the morning sun rose and light spilled across the valley floor, men woke with heavy limbs but lighter hearts. Another day awaited, another chance to keep moving, to reach that far-off trading post, to carve out one more story before the world turned cold again. When the first real warmth settled in, it felt almost unreal. The ice in the men's hair melted quicker each morning, and fingers thawed without needing the harsh crack of rubbing them over the fire. Boots no longer froze solid overnight. Instead, they softened in the damp air, taking the shape of weary feet that had carried them across too many ridges to count. Small streams, once choked silent by ice, now babbled their secrets down the slopes. Sometimes a man would stop mid-step, head tilted, as if listening to an old friend returning after a long silence. There was music in that gurgle, a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat under the ground. They found themselves moving slower now, not from exhaustion, but to savor each detail. The sudden flutter of a jay's wings, the way moss drank up the meltwater in bright green gulps, the sweet smell of wet pine. For a brief moment, the land felt almost forgiving. New growth crept everywhere. Pale green shoots pushing through last year's brittle brown, ferns uncurling like shy dancers greeting the day. Men joked more often. Their laughter carried farther in the mild air. Jokes about lost socks, about snoring so loud it scared off game, about the unspoken longing for a proper meal that didn't come from a trap or a river. In the evenings, the fires burned differently. Flames curled and danced higher, as if celebrating too. Faces glowed, shadows played at the edges of the camp, and stories flowed more freely, less guarded than during the bitterest nights. Someone might lean back and describe the shape of his old porch. Another would remember the creak of a barn door in summer heat. The words didn't always make sense, half sentences drifting off into the night, but the others understood all the same. They spoke of returning to trading posts, of seeing familiar faces lined with new stories and old debts, of the rustle of paper money in dry hands, the sting of whiskey down a clean throat. Dreams took on shape and color again, no longer just vague shadows on the edge of sleep. But even with the warming winds and the promise of new paths, each man carried a piece of the winter inside. A quiet weight in the chest, a set to the jaw that didn't soften completely. The mountains had a way of marking a soul, of leaving quiet signatures in places no one else could see. When they broke camp to move further down the valleys, the land seemed to sigh beneath their feet. The snowline retreated higher, leaving behind meadows ready to burst with color. Birds stitched quick patterns through the sky, and small animals dashed between rocks, eager to reclaim their world from the long cold. Days stretched longer and nights felt kinder. Men laid out their gear in the fading light, checking each strap and buckle as if preparing for a grand dance rather than another day of endless trudge. There was a hush to those evenings, a kind of reverence for having survived the deep dark, for the gift of another season unfolding. Around the fire, they sat closer, shoulders touching lightly, not just for warmth now, but for the simple comfort of human presence. One might toss a stick into the flames, sparks leaping skyward like little messengers, each carrying a secret wish or a half-formed memory. The stars above seemed less cold, more like old companions watching with soft eyes. A few men would nod off mid-conversation, words fading into gentle breaths, heads drooping forward before being jolted back up with a sheepish grin. In those quiet moments, between the last laugh and the first snore, a feeling settled over the group, a fragile mix of relief, gratitude, and a readiness to face whatever paths lay beyond the next ridge. Morning would come again soon enough, and with it, the march forward. But for now, under the soft cloak of spring night, they could rest, hearts still humming with the wild songs of winter, and dream, if only for a while, of gentler days ahead. As spring continued its gentle conquest, the mountains transformed from silent sentinels to watchful guardians draped in soft greens and bright patches of wildflowers. Snow lingered on the highest peaks like stray thoughts that refused to leave, but in the valleys, life pushed forward with a stubborn joy. The men felt it too, deep in their tired bones. Steps grew lighter, backs uncurved from months of hunching against bitter winds. They carried the same battered packs and the same worn-out gear, but their movements hinted at a cautious optimism, a delicate trust in the warmth finally returning. Waterways once locked in ice now shimmered in the sunlight, each bend a mirror to the blue sky above. Fish darted beneath the surface, quick flashes of silver that teased the hungry eyes of passing trappers. Some mornings, a man might pause at a stream, leaning down to scoop up the cold, clear water and let it run over his wrists and face like a blessing. Each day felt like a small festival, the scent of thawing earth and fresh growth wrapped around them, mixing with the constant smoke of evening fires and the tang of old leather. Meals remained simple: dried meat, the occasional fresh catch, but they were eaten slowly now, with heads lifted and eyes tracing the changing horizon rather than staring down into the flames. At night, under skies that felt deeper and more forgiving, conversations drifted into gentle confessions. Someone might admit to missing a brother's scolding laughter, or describe a mother's hands kneading dough on a warm kitchen morning. These words, fragile as newborn shoots, hung in the air long after the speaker fell silent. The fires seemed to crackle more softly, as if listening too. Men leaned back on their elbows, boots stretched toward the warmth, watching stars blink into view one by one like old friends stepping into a quiet room. Sometimes a slow, contented sigh would rise from the circle, floating up to join the thin threads of smoke weaving through the dark. Dreams shifted too, no longer just feverish flashes of bread ovens and warm beds. They grew into full stories, long, winding paths through meadows, voices calling from familiar doorways, the feel of soft earth underfoot instead of sharp rock. In the half-sleep of early dawn, a man might smile, eyes fluttering beneath heavy lids, lips moving to echo a name only he remembered. When the first light spilled over the ridges, it painted the valley in soft gold. Birds announced the day with wild, tangled songs, and even the most stoic trapper felt his heart hitch at the sound. Another day meant another chance, not just to survive, but to truly live, to gather moments that felt as bright and rare as the shimmer of trout in a mountain pool. They still faced hardship. The wild never forgot to remind them of its power. Sudden storms sent them scrambling for shelter, and late snowfalls tested their resolve. But now, each challenge met a man standing a bit taller, with a spark behind his eyes that winter had failed to extinguish. As they moved along old game trails and newly revealed paths, they began to talk of the future in small, careful ways. Plans for the next camp, the possibility of a new rifle, a fresh coat. Dreams of a proper roof overhead again, even if only for a short while before the mountains called once more. By the fireside, each man carried his winter stories like talismans, heavy yet precious. They spoke less of what they lost and more of what they had found. Quiet strength, unexpected laughter, the deep, unbreakable thread tying them to each other and to the wild that had nearly swallowed them whole. And so they went on, stepping lightly into the softening world, their breath no longer ghosts in the air but simple proof that they had endured, that they would keep moving, and that somewhere beyond the next rise, life waited with open, waiting arms. With winter stories still clinging to their minds like frost on a morning window, the men turned toward the next leg of their journey. The wild had softened for a moment, but it still kept secrets, and each man knew the land could turn cruel without a whisper of warning. They followed game trails weaving between thick groves and rocky outcrops, eyes always scanning for movement. Their packs were lighter now, some pelts already traded, some supplies finally eaten down, and each step felt less like a burden and more like an invitation to keep going. The wind carried scents of fresh pine and distant water, and under it all, a steady hum of unseen life beginning to stir. New camps sprang up in small clearings, often near rushing streams or meadows speckled with wildflowers. The fire was no longer just a shield against death, but a center of comfort, a place to dry out wet socks, to lean close and pass around a battered tin cup. Men sat with shoulders relaxed, leaning back against stones warmed by the sun, their faces softened by the glow of flickering flames and the gentle embrace of early summer air. Meals took on a different flavor. Fish roasted on sharpened sticks, wild onions tossed into bubbling broth, fresh shoots nibbled straight from the ground. They ate with real hunger, but also with quiet pleasure, savoring each bite as if each was a small prize. Around the fire, their chatter turned toward the small miracles of the day. The unexpected bend in a river, the sight of a fox slipping between shadows, the first lazy fly drifting above a pond. The nights stretched longer too. Stars shimmered in velvet darkness, and the moon traced slow arcs above, patient and unbothered by the worries of men. They told stories not just to survive the night, but because they needed to spill the words that had waited all winter behind tight lips. Tales of narrow escapes, of sudden kindnesses from strangers, of odd dreams that felt too vivid to ignore. When laughter rose now, it was richer, echoing between tree trunks and slipping out into the open fields. Sometimes, a man would tip his head back, eyes closed, letting the sound of his own voice mingle with the soft rustle of the leaves. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was a release, a long exhale after a season spent holding everything tight inside. Some evenings, a man would wander a little way from camp, finding a flat rock or a fallen log to sit on. There, under the hush of the stars, he might whisper to ghosts only he could see. A father's stern advice, a sister's teasing laugh, a lover's promise that felt as fresh as a new bloom. The forest listened, crickets and frogs offering gentle replies in their own secret languages. In the morning, dew soaked their worn boots and left cool kisses on hands reaching to pack up gear. The air smelled green and sweet, and even the most scarred among them felt something stir in their chests. Another day ahead, another chance to add to the story. They walked with eyes wide open now, greeting each shift of wind and flicker of light as an old friend. Even the occasional slip into mud or a sudden splash into a creek brought laughter rather than curses. Each stumble became a shared joke, a reminder they were alive, still moving, still capable of finding joy in simple stumbles and wet socks. And always the trail pulled them forward. The promise of a distant camp, of new faces and warm bread, and the first cool mug of fresh ale. They carried winter with them still, stitched into muscle and memory. But spring had taught them to breathe again, to share again, to feel the small tremors of hope under each step. By evening, as they built yet another fire and leaned close, the world seemed a little less sharp around the edges. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, in all its messy, raw, and beautiful ways. Along the winding paths and muddy banks, talk often drifted toward food. Not the careful, measured talk of polite company, but the rough, hungry chatter of men who had spent too many nights chewing on stale scraps and dreaming of flavors that once felt ordinary. Beaver tale came up often, with its odd mix of disgust and reverence. Some described it as a gift from the wilderness, a gelatinous, smoky delicacy that stuck to the ribs and warmed the spirit. Others groaned at the thought, remembering nights when it was the only thing between them and an empty belly that echoed into the dark. They would gather around the fire, a freshly caught beaver splayed out nearby, its sleek fur glinting in the flickering light. The tail, thick and paddle-shaped, promised a strange kind of feast. Slicing it off took a practiced hand, careful not to lose the precious fatty layer beneath the tough outer skin. Once stripped, it went straight to the fire, balanced awkwardly on sharpened sticks or laid across hot stones. As it cooked, the fat popped and sizzled, sending up little bursts of smoke that carried a sharp, earthy scent into the night air. Heads tilted forward, eyes bright in the glow, each man tracking every hiss and crackle as though it might reveal a secret. The first bite always brought a pause. Teeth sank into the soft, almost jelly-like meat, and faces twisted in thought. Was it good? Was it terrible? The truth hovered somewhere in between. It was rich, slippery, oddly comforting in a way only true hunger could explain. The taste clung to the tongue and lingered in the throat long after the last piece was swallowed. Men joked that it tasted like old leather dipped in sweet sap, or like a candle left out in the sun too long. Yet no matter the teasing, they always finished it. Hunger smoothed the edges of disgust and turned even the strangest meals into moments of communion. Afterward, they would lean back, bellies warm, letting the slow burn of the fire sink into tired muscles. One might recount the first time he ever tried it, some half-forgotten night near a frozen creek, with a friend now long gone. Another would add a story about trading pelts for a handful of beans, about nearly burning his tongue on a pot of fish stew in a storm. The stories wove together in gentle waves, sometimes overlapping, sometimes drifting off into silence before being caught up again. The darkness around them pressed in, but the shared warmth kept it at bay. In those quiet spaces between words, each man felt the soft pulse of life beneath the wild's endless challenges. Later, when the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, they stretched out on their backs and traced patterns in the stars. Fingers pointed up at imaginary beasts and wandering heroes in the night sky, each constellation carrying a fragment of home or a dream that refused to fade. Sleep crept over them slowly, gentle as morning fog. Dreams that night were filled with the smell of wood smoke and fat, with the feel of soft moss underfoot and echoes of laughter slipping between tree trunks. Some turned in their blankets, murmuring small pieces of their stories into the dark, voices soft as the breeze that rustled the pine needles above. When the first pale streaks of dawn touched the tops of the tallest trees, they rose again. Joints cracked, hands rubbed across faces rough with weeks of growth. Eyes scanned the horizon, and someone muttered a half-serious curse at the stubborn ache in his knees. But despite the groans and curses, there was an unspoken agreement to keep moving, to chase the next meal and the next story, to find the next bend in the river where a new day waited with all its sharp edges and hidden comforts. And so they packed up their few treasures, tied down their furs and tools, and stepped back onto the trail. Their laughter drifted out ahead of them, tangled with bird calls and the low sigh of the waking forest. Another day, another fire, another beaver tail waiting somewhere beyond the next ridge. The trail that morning felt different. Birds darted low across the path, their wings cutting little shapes into the damp air. Water dripped from heavy leaves overhead, each drop a soft drumbeat marking their slow, steady progress forward. Every so often, someone would stop to adjust a strap or tighten a boot, using the moment as an excuse to glance around and take in the waking world. They moved as a quiet pack, boots thudding against old roots and mossy stones. At times, a laugh bubbled up, sharp and sudden, cutting through the hush like a bright spark. Then it would fade, swallowed by the forest's deep sigh. The sound of beaver tails still clung to their thoughts, the odd feast becoming a small legend to carry in their back pockets. By midday, they found a clearing dappled with sunlight and thick with wild mint. It felt like stumbling into a hidden garden, a little gift from the world after so many miles of cold mud and dark forests. Packs dropped to the ground with a chorus of relief, and men sprawled out like cats in the warmth, arms spread, faces turned to the sky. A few picked sprigs of mint, rolling them between calloused fingers and pressing them to their lips. The scent lifted them, tugging at old memories of summer days and faraway fields. Someone started humming, low and tuneful, and another joined in with a quiet whistle. The sound circled above them, weaving into the breeze, drifting toward the edge of the woods where the shadows waited patiently. They talked of home again, but not with the ache that used to tighten their chests. Now it was softer, a gentle weight rather than a sharp blade. Stories of old porches creaking in afternoon heat, of children racing through tall grass with hair like wild straw, of market days when voices rose above barrels of apples and cloth rolls stacked in bright colors. The afternoon drifted by slowly, unhurried and golden. A few men dozed, hats tipped over their eyes, fingers twitching in half-remembered dreams. Others sat cross-legged, mending straps or oiling knives, hands moving almost automatically while their minds wandered to places no map could mark. When the sun began its slow lean toward the west, they stirred. Packs were hoisted once more, gear checked and double-checked, as if each buckle held a secret promise. They stepped back onto the path in a long, uneven line, voices low but edged with a quiet anticipation. As evening crept in, the trees turned to dark silhouettes against a deepening sky. The forest changed its tune, birds hushed, and the wind threaded through the branches like a shy storyteller. They found a small rise, dry enough for a fire, and soon a soft glow licked upward, painting faces in warm strokes. Dinner that night was meager: scraps of dried meat, a few handfuls of crushed nuts, a strip of fish saved from the last stream. Yet they ate with a kind of reverence, each bite savored, each swallow a quiet vow to keep moving, to keep feeling, to keep finding new stories to tuck away under layers of scarred hide and coarse cloth. When the last mouthful was gone and the final log had settled into a bed of deep red coals, they leaned back to watch the sky crack open with stars. Fingers traced lines from one bright point to another. Voices murmured old names for each shimmering speck. Someone chuckled at the thought of the stars as distant fires, each one tended by some cosmic trapper roasting his own strange supper. Sleep came on soft paws. Heads dipped, shoulders slumped together like a row of tired crows. Dreams took them one by one, sliding in quiet as moonlight, carrying them far beyond the rim of their small circle of light. By morning, dew would soak their blankets, and their breath would rise again in silver wisps. But for those few hours, they drifted somewhere between earth and sky, wrapped in mint-scented air and the echo of laughter that might have belonged to a world far gentler than the one waiting just beyond the firelight. Dawn broke gentle and pale, brushing the treetops with soft light. The men stirred slowly, as if unsure whether to trust the morning's kindness. Blankets, damp with dew, peeled away like old bark, and boots were tugged on with quiet groans and a few muffled curses. They moved about camp in small, unhurried rituals, checking the edges of knives with thumbs, tightening worn laces, rubbing stiff shoulders. One man wandered down to the nearby creek, dipping his face into the icy flow. The sharp shock snapped the last tendrils of sleep from his mind, leaving behind a bright clarity that settled into his bones. Breakfast was simple and silent. A few gnawed pieces of jerky, some scraps of dried berries saved for moments just like this. There was no chatter, no elaborate plans laid out. Only the low crunch of teeth against tough meat and the occasional sniff of mint still clinging to fingers from the day before. They shouldered their packs and fell into line, a quiet procession snaking through the trees. The path narrowed, weaving between moss-covered stones and roots that twisted up like old knuckles. Birds called above, their songs skipping across the canopy and down into the dim green underworld where the men walked. As the sun climbed, they broke through into open meadows, sudden bursts of gold and wild color that stopped them in their tracks. Wildflowers bobbed in the breeze, bees hummed in lazy circles, and the earth smelled rich and alive. Even the hardest faces cracked into small, surprised smiles. Someone knelt to pick a handful of blooms, tucking them into the edge of his hat with a quiet pride. Another man, watching, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in mock disapproval, but unable to hide the warmth in his eyes. Small gestures, but they carried the weight of 100 hard nights and 1,000 silent miles. When they pressed on, they moved slower, allowing the land to guide their steps instead of pushing against it. They paused to watch a deer leap through a far clearing, to trace the spiral flight of hawks overhead. Their world had shrunk to these moments. The gentle press of grass against a palm, the flick of a trout's tail in a stream, the soft, forgiving warmth of sun on the back of a neck. By midday, they found another quiet bend in the river. Packs hit the ground with a thud, and boots were kicked off with exaggerated groans. One by one, they sank onto the soft earth, arms sprawled, faces turned upward as though soaking in stories whispered by the sky. Someone pulled out a small tin of leftover fish, passing it around with a conspiratorial grin. Fingers dipped in, each man taking just enough to feel the salt on his tongue and the slight sting of memory that came with it. There were no plates, no ceremony, only the shared act of feeding a hunger deeper than the stomach. The afternoon drifted like a slow river. Voices rose and fell in lazy waves, words sometimes slipping into comfortable silences. One man started carving a stick, the shavings falling like pale curls onto his lap. Another hummed, tapping a foot to a rhythm only he could hear. When the sun began its slow descent, painting the river in ribbons of pink and gold, they gathered up their scattered gear. Boots laced again, shoulders braced for the coming miles. They moved forward as if stepping from one dream into another, the line between sleep and waking as thin as a single breath. Evening brought them to a grove where fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns. A fire sparked up quickly, small flames licking at the night, holding back the dark for just a while longer. They sat close, knees nearly touching, eyes reflecting the dance of light and shadow. One by one, stories unfolded again. Half-true tales of narrow escapes, quiet confessions of missing home, fleeting memories of warmth that felt impossibly far away in winter's heart. Laughter rose like soft thunder, echoing into the trees before slipping away to mingle with the sigh of the wind. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, they leaned back, arms crossed behind heads, and watched the stars claim the sky. Hearts beat slow and steady, each man carrying the echo of the day's small wonders into the fragile shelter of sleep. Morning rose slow and pale, stretching long fingers of light across the grove. Dew clung to blankets and boots, tiny jewels catching the first shy beams of sun. The men woke in stages, rolling stiff shoulders and rubbing the sleep from their eyes, as if peeling away another thin layer of winter's memory. Breakfast was a quiet affair. A few leftover scraps, the last piece of smoked fish shared carefully, passed from one hand to the next without words. They ate in a loose circle, the sound of the river nearby filling the spaces where conversation might have lived. No one hurried. There was a softness to the morning that invited them to linger, to savor the taste of being still. When they finally packed up, it was with the gentle rhythm of men who knew each move by heart. Belts tightened, furs rolled, straps checked and rechecked. They stepped into the path like a single animal, breathing as one, each man tuned to the slow music of footsteps on damp earth. The day's trail took them deeper into the woods, where sunlight filtered through high branches in shifting patterns, dappling faces and hands. The smell of pine needles crushed underfoot mixed with the cool scent of moss and the distant sweetness of flowering shrubs. Birds flickered from branch to branch above, little guardians keeping watch from their green cathedrals. At one bend, they found a stand of wild berries, small and bright against the tangle of leaves. Without a word, they dropped packs and fell to picking, fingers stained red and purple in minutes. Laughter bubbled up, light and surprising, echoing off trunks and carrying far beyond the clearing. For a while, they were boys again, pockets filled with sun-warmed treasures, no thought of traps or trade or the sharp bite of winter nights. After the feast, they lay back on the ground, eyes half closed, hands resting on full bellies. Someone let out a low groan of contentment, and another tossed a berry into the air, catching it clumsily with a grin that cracked open his rough exterior for just a moment. When they moved on, the sun was already leaning toward the west. Shadows stretched across the trail, and the forest shifted into its evening song. Insects droned in long, wavering notes, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker knocked out a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. They walked in companionable quiet, the kind that wrapped around the bones and held tight without needing to say a single word. Now and then, someone would point out a track in the mud or the glint of a hidden creek through the trees. Heads nodded, eyes narrowed in focus, but no one rushed. The land was not a thing to conquer that day. It was an old friend inviting them to wander a little longer. As twilight settled, they found a small rise overlooking a wide bend in the river. The water gleamed like molten silver under the first shy stars, and the breeze carried a sweet, damp breath from its surface. Packs dropped, a fire sparked, and soon thin lines of smoke curled into the growing night. Dinner was humble again. A handful of roasted roots, a bit of dried meat softened in hot water, shared out in careful, quiet scoops. Each swallow felt like a small ritual, a nod to the hunger that had once ruled their every move, now softened by the simple pleasure of warm food and a safe circle of light. Stories drifted up with the sparks, meandering and half-finished, like footprints that faded into fog. Memories of lost trails and found shelters, of distant towns where laughter spilled from doorways, of songs hummed under breath on long, lonely watches. The words didn't always finish. Sometimes they hung in the air, shimmering and incomplete, before drifting away like smoke. When the last ember winked out and the river's voice rose to fill the space, they settled into their blankets, the day's warmth still clinging to their skin. Eyes flickered up to the stars, tracing slow, private patterns, each man drifting into dreams stitched together by the day's small wonders and the long, endless call of the wild beyond the firelight. Morning arrived in gentle waves, a slow unfurling of light that kissed the tops of trees before slipping down to the forest floor. The men shifted beneath their blankets, blinking at the soft shimmer of dew that coated their packs and boots like a quiet blessing. One by one, they rose, stretching sore backs and rolling tight shoulders, moving through the waking world like bears shaking off a long sleep. Breakfast was scarce, the last of the berries, a few crumbles of dried meat shared out with careful hands. Yet no one complained. They ate in silence, listening to the river's constant whisper and the low calls of birds sweeping overhead. Each sound felt like a gentle nudge forward, an invitation to keep going. When they stepped back onto the trail, the world seemed freshly washed. Leaves glistened, branches dripped tiny silver beads, and even the dirt smelled sweet and alive. Boots left dark prints behind, each step a quiet testimony to their passage through this vast, breathing place. They moved in a loose line, sometimes close enough to trade a few low words, sometimes spaced out so each man carried only the sounds of his own footsteps and breath. Now and then, someone would pause to watch a squirrel leap between branches or to study a fallen feather that gleamed white against the dark earth. Small pauses that stitched the day together like patches on an old coat. By midday, the sun pressed down with a soft hand, warming their faces and pulling a thin sheen of sweat across foreheads and necks. They welcomed it, letting the heat seep into bones still haunted by winter's long fingers. When they found a small pool along the river, they dropped packs without hesitation and stepped right in, water slapping against skin with a shock that turned into laughter almost instantly. For a while, they splashed like children, tossing handfuls of water at each other, ducking beneath the surface to emerge gasping and grinning. The echoes of their joy rang out into the woods, bouncing between trunks and rolling back like a half-remembered song. Afterward, they lay on warm rocks, clothes spread out to dry, eyes closed against the sun's bright grin. One man snored softly, mouth open in pure surrender. Another hummed a low, wandering tune that drifted over them like a thin veil. When they dressed again, clothes stiff but sun-warmed, they moved on with a new lightness. Feet found softer rhythms, shoulders dropped, and even the trail's snags and tangles seemed easier to slip past. Each step felt less like a march and more like a dance, a quiet give and take with the land itself. As evening painted the sky in wide strokes of lavender and gold, they chose a small rise for camp. A view opened up there, sweeping across the river's gentle curves and far into the darkening line of trees. The fire rose quickly, crackling to life as though eager to join their newfound ease. Dinner was thin again, a small pot of roots and river weeds, flavored with a pinch of salt and whatever memory of fat still clung to the pot. Yet it was enough. They ate with slow, deliberate bites, savoring each spoonful as if it were a fine feast under chandeliers rather than a thin broth by starlight. Stories began to roll out once more, softer now, carried on the hush of night. One man spoke of a dog he'd left behind, a shaggy creature with eyes too wise for its own good. Another remembered a sister's laugh echoing across a summer field, the sound sharp and clear even here in the deep woods. They listened without interrupting, letting each word sink into the circle like embers dropped onto old coals. When the last voices faded, they tilted heads to the stars, mapping old wishes onto constellations, tracing the same shapes seen by generations before. Sleep came gentle and slow, pulling them under one by one, leaving the fire to hold vigil against the dark. And in that fragile space between dreams and dawn, each man carried the warmth of the day deep into the night, wrapped tight around hearts that had learned, at last, to beat not just for survival, but for the quiet, precious gift of living. Morning crept over the river like a soft sigh, turning the water to liquid gold. The men rose slowly, each movement careful and measured, as though they were learning to inhabit their bodies all over again. One by one, they shuffled toward the edge of the rise, standing quiet as the new light spilled across the valley below. Breakfast was a few leftover roots and a shared strip of dried meat, passed around like a secret handshake. There was no hurry. They chewed slowly, eyes drifting over the haze lifting off the water, the birds swooping low to dip their wings and vanish into the green beyond. When they set off, the world felt almost too tender to touch. Leaves shivered with dew, tiny pearls catching the morning light. The scent of pine and damp earth curled around them, a kind of gentle cloak that softened even the sharpest edges of memory. They moved through narrow paths lined with ferns, their steps muffled on the mossy floor. Sometimes a low whistle drifted back through the line, a simple tune with no real shape, just a sound to remind them they were still here, still moving together. By midday, they reached a small clearing with a circle of stones, a place someone had camped before, maybe years ago, maybe only last week. It felt like a handshake from a ghost, a nod that they weren't the first to pass through this wild heart. They dropped their packs and settled in, shoulders relaxing as they stretched out legs and leaned into the warmth spilling down from above. Someone found a patch of wild onions, and soon a thin pot of broth bubbled over a low flame, the sharp green scent teasing their empty bellies. Laughter rose in quick bursts as they passed around the pot, each man dipping in a cracked spoon or a carved bit of wood. Even the scrawniest sip felt like a feast. One man pretended to toast the sky before slurping loudly, earning a round of gentle curses and half-hearted threats that slipped into easy grins. After they ate, they lounged in the dappled light, hats tilted low, fingers absently tracing lines in the dirt. One started humming a slow, rolling tune, and another joined in, low and off-key, until it became a kind of half-song, half-prayer, rolling between them like a shared breath. When the sun began to slip behind the trees, they stirred. Packs were lifted, shoulders squared, and they stepped back onto the path with the same quiet determination that had carried them across so many frozen miles. The trail bent and curved, slipping deeper into green shadows as the day's last light wove through the canopy. Evening brought them to a small hollow near a trickling stream. Fire sparked to life quickly, flames dancing against the dark like tiny wild spirits. They sat close, knees almost touching, each man lost for a moment in the shifting light. Dinner was sparse again. A few charred roots, a scrap of fish shared with reverence. Yet the silence that followed each bite wasn't heavy. It was soft, almost grateful, as though each mouthful carried a promise to keep going, to keep finding warmth in the simplest things. Stories slipped out in fragments, words spoken more to the fire than to each other. A boyhood mischief that ended in a broken fence and a grandmother's scolding. A first love glimpsed from across a dusty field, all sun and laughter and unreachable sweetness. A brother's hand gripping tight on a river crossing years ago, both faces young and unlined by frost and time. They listened with the patience only the wild can teach, letting each tale drift and settle before another rose. Above, the stars bloomed one by one, patient witnesses to every whispered confession and rough laugh. When sleep came, it felt less like surrender and more like slipping into a familiar embrace. Blankets pulled tight, boots set close, heads resting on folded arms. The fire faded into soft coals, a quiet heartbeat against the night. And in the dark, each man carried his small piece of the day forward, a pocket of warmth against the cold unknown waiting just beyond the edge of dreams. Dawn slipped in like a quiet visitor, brushing soft light across sleeping faces and settling into the folds of their blankets. One by one, they stirred, blinking at the soft gold creeping through the branches above. There was no rush to rise. Each man took a moment to breathe in the cool air, to listen to the gentle murmur of the stream nearby, to remember that they were still here, still moving forward. Breakfast was nothing more than a few leftover scraps, washed down with handfuls of cold water scooped from the stream. Yet the simple act of eating together, of sharing those small bites and cold sips, felt like a quiet ceremony. A promise made again to keep going, to keep looking for warmth wherever it might be found. When they stepped onto the trail, it was with a slow, steady rhythm, boots pressing softly into the damp earth. The forest seemed to lean in around them, branches arching overhead in a green cathedral. Birds darted between shafts of light, their songs skipping along the path like bright pebbles tossed into a pond. They didn't speak much. Words felt too heavy for that morning, too sharp against the gentle hush of the world around them. Instead, they let the sound of footfalls and the breeze through leaves carry them forward. Now and then, someone would pause to touch the rough bark of an old tree or to watch a beetle scurry across the trail, tiny legs working with fierce determination. By midday, they came upon a wide, slow bend in the river. The water moved with a lazy grace, sunlight glinting off its surface in scattered coins of gold. Packs dropped with grateful sighs, and soon boots were off. Feet dipped into the cool current with gasps and low laughter. They sat along the bank, legs stretched, toes wiggling in the shallows. One man leaned back and closed his eyes, head tilted to the sky as if listening to a distant, invisible song. Another plucked a reed and began to chew it thoughtfully, eyes tracing the slow dance of dragonflies hovering above the water. Lunch was no more than a few bites of dried meat and a handful of leaves gathered along the way. Still, they ate slowly, each chew deliberate, as if stretching the moment as far as it would go. The taste of river air and sun-warmed skin folded into each bite, turning it into something more than just food. When they rose to leave, they moved with a new ease, shoulders loosened and steps light. The trail ahead curved gently, leading them into a stretch of meadow where wildflowers painted the ground in broad, joyful strokes. Colors spilled out in every direction. Yellows, purples, whites, swaying together in a quiet, invisible waltz. They paused often, bending to examine a bloom or to let fingers trail through the soft sea of petals. Someone started humming a low, wandering tune, and soon another voice joined, weaving a thin thread of music through the afternoon light. The melody drifted out into the meadow, slipping past the flowers and into the waiting arms of the breeze. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and rose, they found a small hollow beneath an ancient oak. Packs came off, and a small fire flickered to life, its glow a gentle echo of the sunset overhead. Dinner was sparse once more, yet every mouthful carried the warmth of the day, the soft ache of miles walked and laughter shared. They settled close to the flames, shoulders brushing, eyes bright with the reflection of the firelight. Stories rose again, slow and meandering, like smoke curling into the night. Bits of old dreams, half-remembered mischief, voices from long-gone doorways, all tumbling together in the hush between stars. When sleep finally came, it draped over them like a soft blanket, wrapping each man in the scent of earth and ash and wildflowers. And in that quiet darkness, hearts beat steady, each one a small, stubborn promise to keep moving, to keep feeling, to keep gathering these gentle sparks of life wherever the trail might lead next. The morning rose with a tender glow, painting soft pinks and gentle golds across the sky. As the first bird calls trickled down from the canopy, the men woke one by one, rubbing sleep from their eyes and rolling their shoulders against the slight chill still clinging to the air. There was a hush to their movements, a shared reverence for the quiet magic of dawn slipping across the meadow. They gathered near the last smoldering coals, sharing what remained of their food in small, careful bites. Each man chewed slowly, eyes drifting to the horizon where the sun climbed steadily, promising warmth and light for the day ahead. The river whispered nearby, a soft chorus that filled the spaces where words might have been. After packing up, they stepped onto the trail in a loose line, boots finding rhythm in the soft earth. Every few steps, someone would pause to take in a burst of wildflowers or to listen to the layered songs of unseen birds. The forest felt alive around them, a gentle giant breathing deep and slow, wrapping them in green shadows and flickers of golden light. As the morning stretched into midday, the sun warmed their backs and pulled small beads of sweat from their brows. They took a winding path up a low ridge, where the trees opened to reveal sweeping views of the valley below, a quilt of meadows and winding rivers, all stitched together by thin lines of old game trails. They dropped their packs at the top and stood in silence for a moment, each man letting the wide sky and open space wash over him. Faces softened, shoulders loosened. Someone let out a long, low whistle that drifted into the wind like a wandering ghost. Another man laughed, the sound rich and surprised, echoing back from the rocks below. They sat together on sun-warmed stones, passing around a small tin of dried berries found at the bottom of a pack. Each handful was shared like a sacred gift, a tiny burst of sweetness on tongues long used to salt and smoke. Between bites, they traced lines across the horizon with their fingers, naming distant peaks and guessing at the paths they might someday walk. Later, as the light began to shift toward the softer tones of afternoon, they rose again, packs hoisted with small groans and half-smiles. The trail wound down into a stand of tall pines, their trunks straight and narrow as watchful sentries. The air beneath the branches felt cool and damp, carrying the faint perfume of old needles and hidden pools. Their footsteps softened in the thick blanket of fallen needles, and the world seemed to lean closer, listening. They moved like shadows, drifting between shafts of sun, eyes alert but calm. Here and there, a bird startled into flight, a sudden flutter of wings that broke the quiet before settling back into the hush. By evening, they found a small glade where a narrow creek twisted through mossy banks. They made camp without hurry, each man moving in a quiet dance of practiced gestures, stacking wood, setting stones, tending to worn boots and frayed straps. A small fire sprang to life, its glow gentle against the coming dark. Dinner was meager but welcome, a thin stew made from gathered greens and a scrap of meat saved from earlier days. They ate slowly, heads bowed, savoring each spoonful as though it might be the last warm meal before a long, silent stretch of winter. When the bowls were empty and the fire settled into a soft bed of coals, they leaned back to watch the stars slip one by one into the night sky. Voices rose in soft waves, stories shared in pieces. A father's old hunting trick, a grandmother's bread recipe that lived only in memory, a child's first word caught and carried away by a summer breeze. Their laughter, when it came, was low and unguarded, echoing gently against the creek's quiet gurgle. And when sleep finally crept in, it did so like an old friend, folding over them in a gentle hush, weaving dreams of sunlit ridges and secret berry patches waiting somewhere beyond tomorrow's trail. The last morning came in quietly, a soft veil of mist hanging over the creek, turning every sound into a gentle echo. The men rose slowly, each movement filled with the quiet weight of knowing the trail would soon shift, the circle would break, and each man would find a different path beyond these trees. They gathered what little was left. A scrap of meat here, a crumpled handful of dried greens there, and shared the meal in near silence. The air was cool and damp, and as they chewed, their eyes moved across each other's faces, tracing the lines and shadows that had deepened over these long, wild months. When they packed up, it was with careful, deliberate motions. Every strap was checked twice, every piece of gear given a final look, as though each object held a fragment of their shared story. They stood for a moment in the clearing, packs slung and hands resting at their sides, breathing together one last time in the hush of the dawn. The trail out of the glade wound upward, a gentle climb through stands of young birch and silent groves of pine. Sunlight spilled through the trees in slow-moving rivers of gold, brushing over shoulders and warming cheeks. They walked close at first, the line tight, steps in quiet harmony. But as the path opened and the sky grew wider above, they began to drift, each man falling into his own rhythm. They paused often, one last look at a bend in the river, a final touch to the moss on an old stone, a lingering glance at the sway of wildflowers leaning into the morning breeze. Each small moment tucked away like a carefully folded letter, to be read again in the quiet hours of some distant night. By midday, they reached a high meadow where the wind played in long grass and carried the sharp, sweet scent of pine and sun-warmed earth. They dropped their packs there, leaning into the breeze, faces turned to the bright sky above. Laughter rose once more, surprising and free, carrying across the wide open space and tumbling down the slope in soft echoes. They shared one final meal together, the last crumbs of trail rations passed hand to hand, washed down with sips of cool stream water. No one spoke much. There was no need. Every small smile, every glance, carried 100 words they didn't have to say. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the horizon in pale fire, they stood and faced each other. Hands gripped forearms, brief nods passed between them, eyes bright but soft with the ache of parting. And then, slowly, they turned, each stepping into the gentle hush of his own chosen way. One by one, they disappeared into the trees, footsteps swallowed by the soft moss, laughter trailing off like a half-forgotten song. The meadow grew quiet again, holding the memory of their voices and the faint warmth of their passing. Long after the last man vanished, the fire pit remained, a ring of stones cradling a bed of pale ash. Overhead, stars began to blink awake, each point of light a small promise that the trail never truly ends. It simply changes, weaving out beyond the ridges, slipping into new stories carried by other fires, other voices. And somewhere, in the hush of a quiet night or the crackle of a new campfire, the echo of those shared steps and soft laughs lives on, waiting to warm another wandering heart under the wide, forgiving sky.